In this last chapter of Adolescence, we'll be looking at the Erikson psychosocial perspective. This is where we hopefully have had a strong foundation with trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, and hopefully by the time we get here, we've had a strong foundation that allows us to have an identity, and despite our constant changing of maybe preferences or even appearance. It's not unusual to find that during adolescence, teenagers may be skaters for 1 month or 1 semester, and then be maybe gothic individuals the following semester, and then maybe jocks, and they constantly switch the personality, and that is okay. This is their attempt to define and find who they are, and we must go through testing things in there. This is considered to be a major personality achievement in adolescence, and in fact, it's believed to be crucial to becoming a happy adult. And the reason why is because, according to Erikson, if you do not have an identity in place, you are not ready to move on to the next level, which would be intimacy versus isolation. And that's the time where we start dating. And if we do not know who we are, then how can we start dating? We see that there could be a lot of heartache there. So this involves defining our personal values, our ethnic group membership, expression of our sexuality, our moral, political, religious values, and you notice that this is a lot. So it takes years to define this. In fact, oftentimes we find that it's not something that's seen in adolescence. It's something that may be achieved later in life, and it's ongoing. But once formed, this will continue to be refined throughout adulthood. The self concepts of adolescence are now incorporating wider arrays of traits, and you'll see something here that is kind of interesting, and it's an attempt to write as an adolescent would. I'm an extrovert with my friends. I'm talkative, pretty rowdy, and funny. With my parents, I'm more likely to be depressed. At school, I'm pretty intelligent, but I sometimes worry that others may think I'm a total dork. So you'd see the intelligence and dork, you see the depressed, and you see the happiness and funny, and it's all incorporating everything they are in one day, perhaps, with just depending where they are and who they're with. They place a lot more emphasis on social virtues. Social media seems to kind of have validated this in here, and it reflects their concern with being positively perceived by others. The moral standards also begin to appear as key themes among adolescents, and this is something that's supposed to be polished also with our mentors and role models. Ethnic identity, which is a sense of ethnic group and membership and attitudes, is associated with a successful identity development. Now, with ethnic identity, we see that it's consistent with Vygotsky's theory. But Vygotsky is not the only one arguing for this. The argument is that with individuals who may not necessarily be easily accepted, those who may be more likely to be victims of prejudice and discrimination, this can really comprehend their sense of who they are. It's sad to understand and learn of children who are sometimes embarrassed of their cultural heritage, embarrassed to speak their language. And sadly, we live in a society where for a long time it was illegal to speak certain languages, or it was frowned upon and punished even by forced physical punishment. In the 1970s, you may have heard, and there's actually a movie about this called The Walkout, and it's based on Mexican American and Hispanic kids who, in the East Los Angeles area, Boyle Heights, Highland Park, Echo Park, united and walked out in the middle of the school day because they were tired of being beaten by teachers. There were actually physical wooden boards that would be used if a student were to use or speak Spanish in school. And this is something that strongly tarnishes their cultural identity, because a language is a reflection, and possibly one of the strongest reflections and bonds to your culture. You see, if you punish me for doing something that I wore, maybe inadequate clothing, or or some words that I use that were offensive, but they're not necessarily a reflection of my culture, that is okay. But if I speak Spanish because that's my culture and instead I'm punished for that, this is something that can have psychological consequences. We also see historically for over 7 decades among Native Americans that was also pushed against, and that's what they called the ethnic cleansing program, through which they try to get rid of their dialects and they try to get rid of their religion and their culture, and this is what they started calling like the melting pot or the Anglicization of America. And sadly, we see that there are individuals who, among the Native American community, suffer a lot from substance abuse and depression. A suicide attempt is the highest in that ethnic group. So we find that individuals who, again, are targets of prejudice and discrimination oftentimes struggle to identify with their ethnicity. They're caught between standards of a larger society and the traditions of their own culture of origin. And this is something that will bring about something that's called acculturative stress. And this is a psychological distress that results from the conflict between the minority and the host culture. Who do I listen to? It's kind of like having two managers. You know, one manager tells you to do something, then your other manager tells you to do something else. Well, who do you listen to? And it really creates burnout and difficulties. Strong and secure ethnic identity overall results in a higher self-esteem and greater life satisfaction, as you would be able to date individuals and know what you bring to the table and not necessarily compromise on things that you should not be compromising in. With the family, we find the parent-child relationships with more maturity. There's more freedom from parents, and this puts an end to that conflict that was seen in the previous, the beginning stages of adolescence. An effective parent would often strike this balance between remaining connected while at the same time letting go. And this will project warmth, acceptance, trust, and the trust should be still with a sense of supervision. A democratic decision-making process in which the child is taken into account, as well as with firm and consistent discipline, often leads to a good, effective parenting and also a positive response from the child. So we'll see that from middle to late adolescence, the interactions seem to be less difficult than they were at the beginning. As for siblings, we find that there is more involvement in friendships and maybe boyfriend, girlfriend, and this may leave them with less time to spend with their siblings. This, however, despite the lack of connection, it still allows most siblings to remain strong for throughout the rest of their lives. They know that despite the separation, maybe as not doing things together as they used to when they were kids, they know that there is someone they may be able to trust in if they were to need help or assistance. The peers become increasingly important at this time. The friendships, we find that the number of best friends typically declines from 4 to 6 in early adolescence and 1 to 2 in adulthood. And this is something that comes with cognitive maturity. When you define who you are and you realize that you can't give those best friend keychains to every single person you meet, you're beginning to be more selective. You're beginning to know who you like and who you can trust, and this is a good sign. Self-disclosure is still sometimes seen as a problem, as sometimes when an adolescent identifies a best friend, they may share a lot of private thoughts and feelings, and this can be troublesome because despite that improvement in maturity, we still see that the relationships don't last forever. Ideally, you'd have a best friend for life, but that's not seen way too often. So when you disclose a lot of things that can be compromising with someone, it can really kind of backfire. And sadly, we have a lot of cases of depression with individuals whose trust was betrayed by a former best friend. So guiding adolescents about the risks of sharing too much is as important. When it comes to dating, the culture plays a big role in determining when and how we date. Now, we find that among Asian youths, they start dating later significantly than other ethnic groups, and they have fewer dating partners throughout their lives than in Western societies. The parent and friend relationships have a lot to do with how we will express our romanticism. Depending on the role models we've had at home, we may uh, imitate that as we get older. Uh, we see that if men, for example, were to be viewed as uncommitted creatures by females, and there's a daughter growing up in this household where men are viewed and talked about in negative fashion, then the girl is more likely to also not have serious relationships and true intimacy later in life. We find that 10 to 20% of teens are often physically and sexually abused by their dating partners. And this is a problem that is worth elaborating. And sadly, there is a culture that seems to put some pressure on when it's okay to have sex, when it's okay to give in. And that old line that's been used for generations and probably will continue if you truly love me, give me, prove it to me, or give me a sign. That is as old as it gets, and yet it still works among some people. We find that adolescents, oftentimes the girls, are not ready for this in here, but even society sometimes puts pressure for young girls to conform to that. There are rules that I've read in different magazines, not scholarly magazines, but they say that if you go on after the third date, you should have sex. This is a rule that somebody made up without any perhaps cognition about the effect that it could have on someone who has not developed an identity. Young teenagers are dating at this point. If they get a hold of this article that says 3 dates and you have to have sex, then there's this unnecessary pressure, perhaps, especially if there's no guidance among from their parents or peers. So it's important for us to see that oftentimes young girls are raped and sexually abused without knowing that they were raped and sexually abused. There's this book where they speak of girls and their sexuality, and among this case study type of interaction that was obtained from the participants, girls would often say that they had had sex with their boyfriends, but they didn't really enjoy it. Nonetheless, they would do it because they wanted their boyfriend to be satisfied. This is not someone who has an identity in place. Excuse me, this is someone that does not have their identity in place. And as a result of this, they're compromising and giving in to things that are major, things that can leave an imprint in their minds and in their hearts, and it can bring about a lot of psychological consequences, not to mention risk of sexually transmitted infections and pregnancies. Depression is a mood disorder that is typically seen among adults, but we find that this is the most common psychological problem also in adolescence. Depression is not just sadness. It's anyone feels sad at any point in time, but that's not depression. This is feeling sad, frustrated, hopeless about life, oftentimes with loss of pleasure or appetite, disturbances in sleep. They're not focused, and they're often forgetful, and we find that a lot of them seem to suffer from this in here. This is because of typically the pressure of identifying who we are, the loss of friends, and this increases sharply from 12 to 16 in industrialized nations. Sadly, we find that teenage girls are twice as likely as boys to report persistent depressed mood, but it's important for us to note that there are perhaps several other reasons as to why they would feel depressed. Hormonal imbalances is one. The likelihood that a girl would also report this is also greater, which may lead to them being found as more vulnerable to depression. You see, a girl can perhaps go to a female friend or even a male friend and say, "I'm depressed and sad," and cry on their shoulder, and that would be okay. Whereas a guy who goes to his guy friend would probably be laughed at if he were to go over there and cry in front of others. So society and gender stereotypes often make it more likely so that girls may be able to express this and therefore be classified and quantified, whereas for men, we don't necessarily show that because society teaches us that a real man doesn't cry. And this can be problematic as we may be bottling everything inside and still be depressed. Suicide attempt is an increase in adolescence, a third leading cause of death among American youths. And this has tripled from 1960 to 1990 in the United States. We find that girls attempt more than boys, but boys are more likely to kill themselves than girls. And this is because of the ways that they attempt suicide. Boys' attempts and ways of committing suicide seem to be more lethal. It could be a gunshot, it could be knives, whereas girls, there's often popping pills, which can just lead to an intoxication. The culture differences that we see is Caucasian Americans have higher rates than African American and Hispanic, but Native American youths commit suicide at rates that are higher than all national averages and all ethnicities. And also, sadly, we see among the LGBTQ who have 3 times as often as non-LGBTQ. Not surprisingly, the delinquency and crime among teenagers, 12 to 17, who only make up about 88% of the population, and they account for 14% of police arrests, occurs typically during the hours of 2 to 8 p.m. on weekdays. And this is typically when there's no adult supervision. They're let out of school, and maybe parents are not home yet, and that's where we see that the most. We find that there is a rise in early and middle adolescence and delinquency, but then it will decline. So we find that some type of brushing with the law earlier in life once would not be a predictor of antisocial behavior. But if it's repeated throughout their life, then it's something that may be of concern. We find that the school's policy of zero tolerance often does not reduce the aggression or form of misconduct. Sometimes we see that the more of a regular that the kid is to the principal's office, the more hostile they may get as it heightens, it prevents them from having access to education as they're suspended, and also heightens high school dropouts and antisocial behavior.